night had an eerie stillness as Michael approached the gates of the Abandoned Carnival. Rusted chains dangled loosely from the entrance, the iron gates creaking faintly in the wind, as if beckoning him to enter. The sign above, once vibrant with neon lights, now hung crookedly, the letters barely visible beneath years of grime and decay. He hesitated for a moment, feeling an inexplicable chill crawl up his spine, but something deeper, an almost magnetic pull, drew him forward. As he stepped inside, the air grew colder, heavier, and it felt as though the world beyond those gates had ceased to exist. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional groan of ancient metal structures shifting under the weight of time. The rides loomed in the darkness, their skeletal frames casting long, distorted shadows across the cracked pavement. The Ferris wheel, once a beacon of joy, stood still, towering like a sentinel watching over the decayed landscape. But something was wrong. Michael felt it in his gut. The atmosphere was oppressive, as if the carnival itself was alive, breathing in sync with his every step. He passed by the carousel, the chipped paint on the horses' faces giving them grotesque expressions, their eyes following him as he moved. For a brief second, Michael thought he heard the faint, haunting sound of calliope music, distant and distorted, as if carried by the wind from some forgotten time. His breath quickened as he approached the funhouse. Its entrance was a gaping clown mouth, the once playful colors now faded to a sickly, unnatural hue. The eyes of the clown seemed to glint in the darkness, filled with malevolent intent. Michael's pulse raced, but his legs moved forward, almost against his will. As he passed the threshold, the carnival's true nature began to reveal itself. Shadows danced unnaturally along the walls, twisting and writhing in shapes that defied logic. The air inside was thick with the scent of damp wood and something else, something metallic, like blood. Michael stopped abruptly as he spotted something out of the corner of his eye. A figure, small and hunched, moved quickly behind a ride, disappearing into the darkness. His heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't alone. The realization sent waves of fear washing over him, but the worst part was the growing certainty that whatever lurked here had been waiting for him all along. He could feel unseen eyes watching his every move. The carnival itself seemed to hum with a dark, ancient energy. As he ventured deeper, he noticed the rides weren't completely still. The swings on the merry-go-round swayed ever so slightly, though there was no wind. The bumper cars creaked, as if they had been recently used, though no one had set foot in the carnival for years. His mind raced with questions, each more terrifying than the last. Was the carnival alive, or was it something worse? The footsteps echoed in the stillness, each one slow, deliberate, growing louder as they seemed to circle around him. Michael's breath caught in his throat, the air now thick and oppressive. He spun in place, eyes darting across the shadows, but saw no movement. Yet the feeling of being watched intensified, as if unseen eyes were piercing the veil of darkness around him. Panic surged through his veins, and the small cut on his hand burned as if infected by something far more sinister than just the injury. The teddy bear at his feet looked even more distorted now, its remaining button eye glinting in the dim light like a twisted relic from a past that had been waiting for him. Suddenly, a faint voice whispered through the air, barely audible yet unmistakable. It wasn't the wind, nor the rustling of the trees. It was a child's voice, his voice, calling for his mother. "Mom, where are you?" The words drifted through the empty carnival, ghostly and distorted, as though pulled from the very depths of his forgotten memory. Michael's heart pounded in his chest as the voice sent chills crawling up his spine. He hadn't said those words in years, but he remembered them now. Those were the exact words he had cried out when he was lost here, all those years ago. The world seemed to close in on him, the carnival twisting in ways that defied reason. The rusty, decaying rides suddenly seemed to loom larger, their grotesque shapes shifting in the shadows. The lights from the carousel flickered to life with a sickening hum, the horses turning their heads toward him as they began to move in slow, mechanical circles. The distant music, warped and eerie, filled the air again, barely recognizable as the cheerful tune it once was. It felt like a mockery of the place's former life, a distorted memory, just like the ones plaguing Michael's mind. And then, another fragment of that lost day resurfaced, striking him like a blow. He remembered more now, something far darker than simply being lost. There had been someone else here, someone watching him. He had felt their gaze, the icy chill of being observed, hunted. A figure had appeared in the shadows that day, a presence that his young mind had blocked out. But now, that figure was back. Michael's breath quickened as he realized the horrifying truth. The carnival wasn't abandoned because of time or disrepair. It had been abandoned because of what lurked there, something too dangerous to be left standing. The footsteps stopped abruptly, just behind him. He could feel the presence, a malevolent force, standing only inches away, breathing down his neck. He froze, paralyzed by terror, knowing that if he turned around, he might come face to face with whatever had haunted his past. His skin prickled, his heartbeat so loud it drowned out every other sound. The silence that followed was more suffocating than the noise. It was as if the very air had been sucked out of the world, leaving only the pounding of his pulse in his ears. His mind raced, fighting the urge to turn and run, but his feet refused to move. A deep, unnatural chill settled over him, and his vision began to blur at the edges. The carnival was alive, pulsating with a dark energy that was tied to him, bound by something from his past that refused to stay buried. Michael clenched his fists, the pain in his hand now unbearable, as though the cut was spreading through his veins like poison. He needed to remember. He needed to know what had happened that day, the truth that had been locked away in his mind. But the truth came with a price. Another voice broke through the suffocating silence, low and guttural, rasping in a language he couldn't understand. It wasn't human, yet it was all too familiar. The words slithered into his mind, ancient and malevolent, pulling him deeper into the carnival's web. The shadows around him thickened, and the once familiar landscape twisted further, turning into something out of a nightmare. The rides, now grotesque and distorted, seemed to breathe, their mechanical limbs creaking as if they were alive, watching him with a hunger that sent waves of nausea through his body. Desperate, Michael turned toward the source of the footsteps, but there was no one there, just an empty pathway leading deeper into the heart of the carnival. But the whispers continued, closer now, surrounding him. He wasn't alone, not anymore. And as he stepped forward, a sickening realization dawned on him. The figure from his past, the one he had sensed all those years ago, had never left. It had been waiting, hiding in the shadows of his memory, patiently stalking him. It wasn't just a part of the carnival. It was the carnival. This place, this nightmare, had been built around it, a prison for something far worse than any ghost or lingering spirit. The past, long buried and forgotten, was now fully awake. Michael's own voice, his 6-year-old self, echoed through the night again, louder, pleading, "Mom, help me." But this time, it wasn't just a memory. The cry came from the darkness ahead, drawing him deeper into the abyss. The carnival wanted him back, and this time, it wouldn't let him leave. Michael's footsteps echoed through the twisted remnants of the carnival as the unsettling whispers grew louder, their voices layered, overlapping, and distorting into something that crawled under his skin. Every step felt heavier, as though the ground itself was pulling him deeper into its clutches. The shadows around him thickened, their shapes twisting into grotesque figures that seemed to watch him, waiting for something. The weight of dread bore down on him, and as he reached the heart of the carnival, a desolate clearing where the central ride, a towering Ferris wheel, loomed over him, he felt a pull that wasn't just physical, but psychological, as if the place itself was forcing him toward a decision. In the middle of the clearing stood something unexpected, a small table, illuminated by a dim, flickering light that seemed to bleed out of nowhere. On the table sat a photo album, old and dusty, yet somehow preserved, untouched by the decay around it. His heart clenched as he recognized it. The album was his, from when he was a child. Trembling, he approached it, and as he opened the first page, the images inside sent shockwaves through his mind. Each photo was a snapshot of his past, moments he had thought lost, his family, his childhood, and most disturbingly, his visits to the carnival. Flipping through the album, Michael's breath caught in his throat as the pictures began to distort. The images twisted, the faces of his family warping into grotesque, unrecognizable forms. But amidst the horror, one photo stood out. It was of him, as a child, holding his teddy bear with a wide smile. Behind him, just barely visible, was the shadow of a figure, tall, hunched, its face obscured by darkness. The realization hit him like ice in his veins. That figure had been with him all along. It wasn't just a memory. It was something more, something real, something that had been waiting for him to return. Suddenly, the air grew colder, and the shadows around him began to close in. From the darkness, a voice emerged. It was deep, ancient, and filled with malice. "You've come back, as I knew you would." The words sent a jolt of terror through him, but before Michael could react, the figure stepped into the dim light. It was the same presence he had felt all those years ago, now fully revealed, a grotesque, shifting form that defied explanation, its body flickering between shadows and substance. Its eyes were hollow, dark voids that seemed to swallow the light around them. "You've forgotten much, but the carnival remembers," the voice rasped. The figure raised one twisted hand and pointed at the photo album. "There's a price for leaving this place, a price you never paid." Michael's pulse quickened as the ground beneath him trembled. He instinctively took a step back, but the figure's voice followed, wrapping around him like a vice. "You have a choice," it hissed, the words slithering into his mind. "Give me what I seek, or lose everything you hold dear." The impossible choice hung in the air like a dark cloud, suffocating him. Michael's chest tightened as the figure gestured toward the album once more. His past, his memories, his identity was tied to that book. And now, the entity wanted something more, something he couldn't bear to give. His happiest memory flashed before his eyes. A perfect day with his parents at the park, their laughter ringing in his ears, their love a shield against the world. The figure wanted that. It demanded that Michael sacrifice his most precious memory, the one thing that kept him sane amidst the madness. If he gave it up, he knew he would lose a part of himself forever. But the alternative was far worse. Michael knew the entity wasn't bluffing. If he refused, if he clung to his past, the carnival would consume him, body and soul. He would be trapped here, just like the others whose faint whispers still lingered in the shadows. The other souls it had claimed. His mind raced, torn between two unbearable options. The figure loomed closer, its dark presence pressing down on him like a weight. "Decide before the carnival decides for you," it growled. Michael's hands trembled as he reached for the album, his fingers brushing the worn cover. The memories were flooding back now. His mother's smile, his father's comforting voice, the warmth of their love. He could feel the entity pulling at the edges of his mind, urging him to give in, to let go. But the thought of losing that memory, of letting the darkness take away the last piece of his humanity, was unbearable. His mind screamed at him to run, to fight, but there was no escape. He was trapped in a nightmare, and the only way out was to choose. As his hand hovered over the album, the carnival around him began to shift. The rides creaked to life, their metal groaning like tortured souls. The Ferris wheel turned slowly, its lights flickering in and out, casting long, eerie shadows that danced across the clearing. The carousel's music began to play, warped and dissonant, as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling around him. Time was running out. Finally, with a shuddering breath, Michael made his decision. His fingers curled around the photo album, and he knew what he had to do. The entity smiled, a grotesque, hollow grin, as Michael felt his most cherished memory slipping away, dissolving like mist in the night. The laughter, the warmth, the love, all gone, replaced by a cold emptiness that settled deep in his soul. The carnival went silent. The figure retreated into the shadows. Its work done, Michael stood alone, the weight of his choice crushing him from within. He had survived, but at what cost? The memory was gone, erased from his mind forever. And though the carnival had released him, he knew he would never be whole again. The entity had taken more than just a memory. It had taken a piece of his soul. As Michael turned to leave the clearing, the wind whispered through the dark, carrying with it the faint sound of a child's laughter. His laughter, from a time long forgotten. And in the shadows, the carnival waited, knowing that one day it would call him back once more. The air grew colder as Michael moved deeper into the heart of the abandoned carnival, his skin prickling with an unnatural chill that seemed to seep into his bones. The night had thickened around him, pressing down with a suffocating weight as though the darkness itself had substance. The once silent rides now groaned softly, their rusted joints creaking, as if disturbed by his presence. But what unnerved him most was the sound, the faintest whisper, drifting through the night like a sigh. It was subtle at first, almost indistinguishable from the rustling of dead leaves or the distant hum of forgotten machines. But as he stood still, ears straining, the whisper grew clearer, more insistent, as if the shadows themselves were speaking to him. It was not a single voice, but many, overlapping and weaving together in a dissonant melody. The words were incoherent, garbled, slipping just out of comprehension. Yet, beneath the jumbled sounds, there was a feeling, an ancient malice, a hunger that made his stomach churn. Michael's breath came in shallow gasps as he realized the voices weren't coming from any one direction. They were all around him, emanating from every dark corner, every shadow that flickered at the edge of his vision. The whispers seemed to crawl up his spine, wrapping around his mind like cold tendrils, urging him to listen more closely, to understand the unknowable. His eyes darted around the carnival grounds, trying to find the source, but there was nothing to see, only the creeping darkness and the dilapidated rides, frozen in time. The merry-go-round's painted horses now seemed alive in the dim light, their glassy eyes reflecting a strange glint, as though they were watching him, waiting for something. The swings, hanging lifeless moments ago, began to sway ever so slightly, moved by an invisible force. Michael felt his heart pound in his chest as a slow realization settled over him. The carnival was no longer just a place. It was awake. He took a cautious step forward, his shoes crunching on the gravel path, the whispers intensifying with each movement. They swirled around him, threading through the air like a venomous fog, and though the words were still indecipherable, the tone was clear, warning, tempting, mocking. The shadows grew longer, stretching unnaturally across the ground, as if reaching out to pull him into their depths. For a fleeting moment, Michael saw something move, a flicker of a figure, darting between the rides, too fast for him to follow. His body froze, fear gripping him with an icy hand. He wasn't alone anymore. The whispering voices grew louder, more urgent now, as if they were converging on him, and with them came the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Michael's skin crawled as he felt the weight of unseen eyes boring into him from the dark. He could hear faint footsteps now, soft and deliberate, echoing through the empty carnival grounds. But no matter how quickly he turned, there was nothing there. The atmosphere shifted, thickening, as if the very air had turned against him. His breath fogged in the cold, unnatural chill, and his pulse raced, his mind teetering on the edge of panic. A sharp, metallic clang echoed through the night, shattering the oppressive silence. Michael spun around, his heart leaping into his throat, and saw that the funhouse door had swung open on its own, its rusted hinges groaning like a dying thing. Inside, the darkness was absolute, but something within beckoned him, a subtle pull that made his feet inch forward despite the screaming warnings in his head. The whispers surged, no longer distant, but surrounding him, pressing into his ears, filling his mind with a cacophony of maddening voices. They were clearer now, though still fragmented, fragments of language he almost understood. And yet, the intent was unmistakable. They wanted him inside. His body moved, as if not entirely his own, compelled toward the funhouse entrance. He tried to resist, but his legs carried him forward, step by agonizing step. The whispers were no longer content to merely surround him. They had invaded his thoughts, whispering dark promises, twisted desires. "Come closer," they beckoned, their tones sweet like poison. "We've been waiting for you." The funhouse loomed before him, its garish, faded paint mocking the idea of joy. The entrance was shaped like the gaping mouth of a clown, its teeth chipped and rotten, a grotesque parody of laughter. And inside, Michael could feel the presence waiting, something far worse than the shadows that whispered in his ear. He hesitated at the threshold, his body trembling. The shadows inside the funhouse shifted, alive with unseen motion. For a fleeting second, he saw a flash of something, eyes gleaming in the dark, staring back at him with a hunger that made his skin crawl. Then they were gone, swallowed by the inky blackness, leaving only the whispers. "Remember," they hissed, their voices slicing through his mind like cold knives. "You were always meant to return." The words sent a jolt of terror through him, his mind reeling as fragments of his forgotten past flooded back. He had been here before, as a child, and something terrible had happened. His legs buckled, and Michael fell to his knees, his hand gripping the cold, hard ground as the memories came crashing down on him. He remembered running through the carnival, his small hands clutching a balloon, the sound of his parents' laughter in the distance. But then, darkness. A voice, not unlike the one he now heard, had called to him from the funhouse. He had wandered inside, alone, lost in the maze of mirrors and distorted reflections. And in the center of it all, he had seen something, a figure, tall and monstrous, its face a blur of shifting shadows, its eyes glowing with malevolent light. Michael's breathing grew ragged as the realization hit him. This was no ordinary carnival. It was a trap, a prison for something far older, far darker. The whispers weren't just random noise. They were the voices of those who had come before, those who had been consumed by the presence that lived in the shadows. And now, it wanted him. The funhouse door creaked wider, inviting him in, as the whispers reached a fever pitch, their voices merging into a single, terrible command. "Enter." Michael stood, his body shaking, torn between the overwhelming compulsion to obey and the primal instinct to flee. But deep down, he knew there was no escape. The carnival had woken, and would not let him go so easily. Michael's grip tightened on the edge of the funhouse door as the overwhelming pressure of the carnival's malevolent force closed in around him. The whispers were now inside his head, twisting his thoughts, warping his reality. His breath came in ragged bursts, and his vision blurred at the edges, as though the world around him was melting away, becoming something unrecognizable. The darkness was no longer just the absence of light. It was alive, pulsating with energy, thick and tangible like a living entity pressing against his skin. And in the depths of that darkness, the shadows began to take shape. As he stepped inside the funhouse, his surroundings seemed to ripple and shift. The distorted mirrors lining the walls reflected not just his image, but twisted versions of himself. Figures with hollow eyes, faces contorted in silent screams. The mirrors stretched and twisted unnaturally, warping his reflection until it became something monstrous. Each version of him appeared more decayed than the last, as though the darkness inside the carnival was corrupting not only his body, but his soul. Every flicker of movement in the mirrors was followed by an echo of the whispers, calling his name in haunting, distorted tones. "Michael." The voices slithered through the air, drawing him deeper into the funhouse's maze of horrors. His hands trembled as he moved forward, each step weighted with a growing sense of dread. The walls seemed to close in on him, narrowing, pressing against his mind. The funhouse was more than just a building. It was a manifestation of his worst fears, feeding on his terror, warping reality itself. He felt as if he was being swallowed by the very structure, each distorted reflection taunting him, showing him pieces of himself he wished he could forget. Suddenly, the air grew thick with an unnatural cold, and a shadow passed across one of the mirrors, a shape that didn't belong to him. Michael froze. His pulse pounded in his ears as he turned slowly, eyes searching the mirror for the source of the movement. It was then that he saw it. A figure stood behind him, barely visible in the dim light. Its form was tall, impossibly thin, and cloaked in a darkness that seemed to devour the light around it. It had no face, only a smooth, featureless void where eyes should have been. And yet, Michael could feel its gaze upon him, drilling into his soul. The figure didn't move, but Michael's heart raced as if it were inching closer. The fear was suffocating, an overwhelming force that gripped his chest and squeezed until he could barely breathe. The whispers intensified, urging him to turn away, to run, but his legs were frozen in place. Every instinct screamed at him to flee, but something deeper, a sinister pull, kept him rooted to the spot. The figure remained motionless, but its presence grew more oppressive, a weight that pressed down on his mind, warping his thoughts. And then, the carnival began to play tricks on his senses. The funhouse mirrors around him started to ripple, like the surface of disturbed water, and the reflections within them changed. Instead of showing his distorted image, the mirrors began to reflect moments from his life, moments of fear, of vulnerability. He saw himself as a child, lost in the carnival all those years ago, crying out for his parents. He saw himself as a teenager, standing over his mother's grave, consumed by grief and loneliness. The mirrors didn't just reflect his physical form. They showed him his darkest memories, the moments he had tried to bury deep within his mind. His fear began to manifest physically, distorting the world around him. The walls of the funhouse stretched and bent, the mirrors warping further as his panic grew. His mind was unraveling, and the carnival was feeding on it, thriving on his terror. His surroundings twisted into a surreal nightmare, and the whispers took on a new tone, mocking, taunting him with his own memories. "You can't escape it. You never could." The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, pressing against his skull like a vice. The shadowy figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, its form barely discernible in the flickering light. Michael's legs trembled, and the cold sweat on his skin made him shiver uncontrollably. As the figure approached, his fear reached a crescendo. The funhouse, the mirrors, the distorted reality, it all began to blur, and Michael's mind spiraled into chaos. But the whispers weren't just trying to terrify him. They were tempting him, luring him deeper into his own despair. "Let go," the voice hissed in his ear, as the figure loomed over him. "Give in to the fear. It's easier this way." The offer was clear. Surrender to the terror, and the nightmare would end. He could feel it pulling at him, the darkness wrapping around his heart like tendrils, offering him an escape, a way out of the overwhelming dread. But deep down, Michael knew what it meant. If he gave in, if he allowed the fear to consume him, he would lose himself completely. The carnival would claim him, just as it had claimed so many before. The mirrors around him flickered again, and now they showed something even worse. Visions of the future, his future, if he chose to resist. He saw himself trapped in the carnival forever, wandering its twisted halls as a shadow of who he once was. His face reflected back at him, gaunt, hollow, lifeless. The whispers promised him peace, an end to the suffering, if only he would submit to the fear. The temptation was almost unbearable. The fear was so overwhelming, so suffocating, that part of him wanted to give in, to let it take him. But a voice, faint and distant, cut through the haze. His own voice. A memory surfaced, one of his mother, comforting him as a child. "Fear doesn't define you, Michael. It's what you do with it that matters." The words were a lifeline, pulling him back from the brink. His breath steadied, and he clenched his fists, feeling the weight of his decision press down on him. He couldn't give in. He wouldn't let the carnival win. Not like this. Summoning what little strength he had left, Michael forced himself to step back, away from the figure, away from the temptation of fear. The shadows recoiled, hissing in frustration, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. But he ignored them. The funhouse distorted around him, the mirrors cracking, shattering as the illusion began to crumble. He stumbled backward, his mind reeling, but he kept moving, kept resisting, even as the carnival tried to pull him back into the darkness. The figure in the shadows vanished, and for a moment, the whispers ceased. The carnival fell silent, as though it were holding its breath, waiting to see if Michael would fall. But he didn't. With one final glance at the shattered mirrors, he turned and ran, away from the funhouse, away from the terror that had nearly consumed him. The carnival had tempted him with his greatest fear, but he had survived for now. But deep down, Michael knew this was far from over. The carnival wasn't done with him yet. The air in the carnival grew heavier as Michael stumbled out of the funhouse, his heart still pounding from the encounter with the shadowy figure. The whispers had faded, but the oppressive atmosphere lingered, pressing down on him like a weight he couldn't shake. The carnival seemed to shift around him, its once familiar paths twisting into something alien, the rides looming over him like ancient sentinels. He knew now that there was no escape. This place wasn't just a relic of the past. It was alive, and it had been waiting for him. As Michael moved forward, his feet dragging along the cracked pavement, the ground beneath him began to tremble. The faint rumble echoed through the carnival, growing louder with each step. The rides creaked, their rusted metal groaning as if awakening from a long slumber. He could feel the presence now, stronger than ever, a dark force that pulsed beneath the surface, waiting to be revealed. The whispers hadn't just been random voices. They had been leading him to this moment, to the heart of the carnival's curse. And as he approached the center of the abandoned grounds, a realization struck him like a bolt of lightning. The force behind the carnival wasn't just a ghost or a lingering malevolence. It was tied to him. The fragmented memories from his childhood, the visions in the funhouse, all pointed to the same truth. The darkness had been waiting for him to return because he was the key. He had brought it with him unknowingly, all those years ago. And now, it wanted to complete what had been left unfinished. A massive structure came into view, the Ferris wheel, towering over the carnival like a grim monument. Its once bright lights flickered faintly in the darkness, casting long, eerie shadows across the ground. At the base of the wheel, a figure stood waiting. Michael's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the silhouette. His younger self, no older than 6, clutching the ragged teddy bear he had found earlier. The boy's face was pale, his eyes wide with fear, but there was something off about him, something that made Michael's skin crawl. The boy didn't move, didn't speak, but Michael felt the weight of his gaze. This was no mere hallucination. The carnival had manifested his past, brought it to life to confront him with the truth he had buried deep within his mind. And standing next to the boy was the shadow, the same faceless entity that had haunted his every step, now fully formed, its presence radiating a dark energy that made Michael's knees weak. "You've come back," the shadow whispered, its voice a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from the depths of the earth. "It's time to finish what you started." Michael's breath caught in his throat as the memories he had long suppressed came flooding back in a torrent. He had been here before, this exact spot, this exact moment. As a child, he had wandered away from his parents, lured by the strange energy of the carnival. He had stumbled upon the Ferris wheel, where the entity had appeared to him for the first time, its dark tendrils reaching out to him, whispering promises of power, of knowledge. But he had been too young, too scared to understand what it wanted. In his fear, he had run, leaving behind more than just his teddy bear. He had left a piece of himself, and now the carnival demanded that piece back. The ground trembled violently, cracks splintering across the pavement as the Ferris wheel began to turn, slowly at first, then faster, as though powered by the dark force that emanated from the shadowy figure. The air crackled with energy, the temperature dropping until Michael could see his breath fogging in front of him. His younger self stood frozen, eyes locked on the wheel as it spun, its lights flickering faster, casting grotesque, distorted shapes on the ground. Michael felt the pull in his chest, a deep, aching void that he hadn't realized was there until now. "You left something behind," the shadow hissed, stepping closer, its form growing larger, more solid. "And now, you will take your place." Michael's pulse quickened. The carnival had been waiting for him, not just to return, but to fulfill the pact he had unknowingly made as a child. The shadow wanted him to merge with the darkness, to become part of the very thing that had haunted him for so long. He could feel it now, pulling at the edges of his consciousness, tempting him with the promise of release, of understanding. It would be so easy to give in, to let the darkness claim him, to become one with the entity that had waited all these years. But as the pull grew stronger, Michael's thoughts turned to his family, his mother's warm smile, his father's reassuring voice. The memories of love, of hope, fought against the encroaching darkness, reminding him of who he was, of what he still had to live for. The shadow loomed over him, its tendrils reaching out, ready to engulf him, but Michael refused to move. "I won't," he whispered, more to himself than to the entity. "I won't become you." The shadow recoiled slightly, as if surprised by his defiance. "You have no choice," it growled, its voice rising in intensity. "You were always meant to return. You cannot escape your fate." But Michael knew now that fate wasn't as simple as the carnival wanted him to believe. He wasn't the same scared child who'd run away all those years ago. He had a choice, and he wasn't going to let the darkness take him without a fight. With a surge of adrenaline, Michael stepped forward, defying the pull of the shadow. The Ferris wheel screeched to a halt, its lights flickering wildly as the ground trembled beneath him. The younger version of himself watched silently, his wide eyes reflecting the chaos around them. Michael reached out to the boy, his hand trembling but determined. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," he said softly, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "We can end this." The boy didn't respond, but the shadow did. It lashed out, its dark tendrils whipping through the air with a force that sent Michael stumbling backward. The ground split open beneath the Ferris wheel, and from the gaping chasm, a deafening roar erupted, shaking the very foundations of the carnival. The darkness was fighting back, refusing to let go of the grip it had on him. But Michael held firm, digging deep into the strength he didn't know he had. "You will not take me," Michael growled, his voice filled with a determination that echoed through the night. "Not again." The shadow surged forward, its form shifting, twisting, trying to consume him, but Michael stood his ground. The void in his chest began to close, the pull of the darkness weakening as the memories of his past solidified in his mind. He wasn't alone. He never had been. And with that realization, the connection between him and the carnival began to break. The ground shook violently one last time before the shadow let out a final, ear-piercing shriek, dissolving into the air like mist. The Ferris wheel stopped, its lights flickering once before going dark. The air grew still, the oppressive weight lifting as the carnival fell silent once more. Michael stood there, breathless, his body trembling but whole. The younger version of himself was gone, and the shadow had disappeared into the night. The carnival was empty, its dark secrets buried once again, but Michael knew it wasn't over. The entity had been defeated, but the darkness would always linger, waiting for its chance to return. For now, though, Michael had won. The carnival lay in eerie silence, the air thick with the weight of what had just transpired. Michael stood at the base of Ferris wheel, his heart pounding in his chest as the darkness seemed to retreat into the shadows. But he knew better. This was far from over. The entity wasn't gone, not entirely. He could still feel it lurking just beneath the surface, watching, waiting. The wind picked up, carrying with it a low, distant moan that seemed to resonate from the very heart of the carnival. The ground beneath his feet trembled, and the shadows began to stretch unnaturally once more, creeping toward him like long, grasping fingers. From the darkness, a deep rumble echoed, and the Ferris wheel creaked to life again, its rusted gears grinding against each other as it began to turn, slowly at first, then faster, its skeletal frame casting grotesque shadows across the cracked pavement. The lights flickered on, but instead of the warm glow of a carnival ride, they burned with a sickly, unnatural hue, illuminating the scene with a haunting glow. Michael could feel the presence intensifying, as if the entire carnival was awakening, fueled by the entity's rage. Suddenly, from the darkness behind him, a guttural voice spoke, deep and resonant, filled with an ancient malevolence that made Michael's blood run cold. "You think you can escape me?" The words were drawn out, each syllable dripping with venom, as the entity took shape in the shadows before him. The figure was no longer just a vague silhouette. It had grown in power, its form solidifying into something more tangible, more terrifying. The shadowy figure loomed over him, its body writhing and shifting as if it were made of pure darkness itself. But now it had substance, and its eyes, two glowing voids, locked onto Michael with a gaze that felt like it could pierce his soul. Michael staggered back, the weight of the entity's presence pressing down on him like a physical force. His mind raced, fear clawing at his thoughts. But he knew that running wasn't an option. The carnival had brought him here for a reason, and this moment had been inevitable. The entity stepped forward, its voice a low growl. "You were always mine, Michael. You've been running from me your entire life." The words sent a chill through his spine. The entity wasn't just talking about the carnival. It was talking about something deeper, something that had been haunting him for years, lurking in the darkest corners of his mind. Memories flashed before his eyes, moments of fear, of doubt, of failure. He realized now that the entity had been feeding off those emotions, growing stronger each time he gave in to them. Every decision he had made, every time he had been consumed by fear, the entity had been there, whispering in his ear, pushing him further into the darkness. And now, it was ready to claim him completely. The ground beneath Michael's feet cracked, splitting open as tendrils of darkness snaked out, reaching for him, twisting and writhing like living creatures. He backed away, but the tendrils moved faster, latching onto his legs, his arms, pulling him toward the gaping maw of the chasm that had opened beneath the Ferris wheel. The entity stood at the edge, watching with a cruel smile that sent a wave of nausea through Michael's body. "There's no escape," it whispered, its voice echoing in his mind. "You belong to me." But Michael wasn't ready to give up, not yet. Gritting his teeth, he struggled against the tendrils, pulling at them with all his strength. The shadows tightened their grip, digging into his skin like cold, sharp claws, but he refused to let them drag him down. The darkness surged around him, but amidst the chaos, a single, clear thought emerged in his mind: his family, his mother, his father, the love they had given him, the strength they had instilled in him. It wasn't just fear that defined him. There was more. There was light. Summoning every ounce of willpower he had left, Michael focused on that light, that love, and let it fill him. The tendrils recoiled slightly, as if the entity could feel the shift in his resolve. The darkness pressed in harder, the ground cracking and splintering beneath him as the entity growled in frustration. But Michael held on. "I don't belong to you," he whispered, his voice trembling but steady. "Not anymore." The entity roared, its voice shaking the very foundations of the carnival, but Michael stood his ground. The light inside him grew stronger, pushing back against the shadows, weakening their grip. The tendrils writhed and twisted, struggling to hold onto him, but one by one, they began to snap, disintegrating into nothing as the power of the darkness faltered. The entity howled in rage, its form flickering, losing shape as the light continued to grow. Michael could feel the shift, the balance tipping in his favor, but he knew he couldn't stop now. He had to end this. With a burst of strength, he broke free from the last of the tendrils and took a step forward, toward the entity. The shadows recoiled, writhing and thrashing in the air as the entity's form flickered and shifted, struggling to maintain control. "You cannot defeat me," it screamed, its voice now tinged with desperation. "I am everything you fear. everything you've ever feared. But Michael kept moving forward, the light inside him burning brighter with each step. The darkness shrank away from him, recoiling like a cornered animal. "You're nothing," Michael said, his voice strong and unwavering. "You're just fear, and fear only has power if I let it." The entity shrieked in fury, its form collapsing in on itself as the light consumed it. The Ferris wheel groaned and creaked, its lights flickering wildly as the entire carnival seemed to shudder under the weight of the confrontation. The ground beneath Michael's feet rumbled, the chasm widening as the entity made one final, desperate lunge toward him. But it was too late. The light exploded outward, blinding and pure, engulfing the carnival, swallowing the shadows whole. The entity let out one last, bone-chilling scream before it disintegrated, its form dissolving into the air like smoke. The ground steadied beneath Michael, the chasm closing as the light faded back into the night. The carnival was silent once more, the oppressive weight of the darkness lifted. Michael stood alone, the cold night air wrapping around him like a blanket of relief. The Ferris wheel had stopped, its lights extinguished, the once menacing structure now nothing more than a lifeless relic. For a long moment, Michael didn't move. The adrenaline still coursed through his veins, but the terror had faded, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. He had done it. He had faced the darkness, the fear that had haunted him his entire life, and he had won. The carnival had wanted to claim him, but in the end, it had been the fear itself that had been defeated. But even as the silence settled over the empty grounds, Michael knew that the victory hadn't come without a cost. He had faced the darkness and survived, but the carnival still stood, a monument to the fear that lurked in the hearts of everyone who came near. It would wait, just as it had waited for him, for the next lost soul to stumble through its gates. And when they did, it would be ready to claim them. Michael turned and walked away from the carnival, the weight of what he had experienced still heavy on his shoulders. The shadows no longer followed him, but he knew they were still there, watching from the distance, waiting for the next moment of weakness. He had won, for now, but the darkness was never truly gone. The dawn began to creep over the horizon, casting pale light across the abandoned carnival, but the eerie atmosphere remained thick, clinging to the air like a heavy fog. Michael's footsteps were slow, unsteady, as he made his way toward the exit. Every part of him was exhausted, both physically and mentally, but the sense of unease hadn't left him. Despite defeating the entity, there was a lingering darkness, a feeling that something still watched him from the shadows. The carnival was silent, but it felt like a silence full of anticipation, like it wasn't quite ready to let him go. As he passed through the rusted gates, a cold wind swept through the grounds, carrying with it a faint, almost imperceptible sound, the distant echo of a child's laughter. Michael stopped dead in his tracks, his skin prickling with a familiar dread. He turned, glancing back at the carnival one last time. The towering Ferris wheel stood still, its skeletal frame bathed in the early morning light. The rides, the booths, and the dark corners of the funhouse were all quiet, lifeless. But something about the way the shadows lingered in the corners, clinging to the broken rides, told him that the carnival wasn't truly at rest. There was a feeling in the air, one that he couldn't shake, a sense that the entity he had faced wasn't entirely gone. It had dissolved into the shadows, defeated for now, but the carnival had been its home for far too long. It was like a festering wound in the fabric of reality, a place where fear, misery, and dark energy had taken root. Michael felt it deep in his bones. The carnival was still alive, still waiting, and in time, it would call to another unfortunate soul. As he turned to leave, his gaze caught on something glinting near the entrance, a small object, half buried in the dirt. Curiosity got the better of him, and despite the overwhelming urge to leave, he bent down and picked it up. His heart sank when he realized what it was, a faded, worn-out ticket. The carnival's logo was barely visible beneath layers of grime and age, but the date printed on it sent a shiver down his spine. It was the same day he had come here as a child. The day everything had changed. Michael's hands trembled as he stared at the ticket, his mind racing. How could it be here now? After all these years, it didn't make sense. But then again, nothing about this place made sense. The carnival had its own rules, its own way of bending time and reality to suit its dark needs. He had thought he understood it, thought he had escaped it, but this was something else. The ticket was a message, a reminder that he hadn't truly escaped. Not yet. With a sharp intake of breath, Michael shoved the ticket into his pocket and hurried toward his car, his nerves fraying with every step. The wind seemed to pick up, swirling dust and debris around him, almost as if the carnival was trying to pull him back. The shadows danced at the edge of his vision, twisting into shapes that resembled the entity, flickering just out of reach. He refused to look back again, refused to give in to the nagging fear that the carnival wasn't done with him. But as he reached the car, the feeling of being watched grew stronger, like cold fingers brushing the back of his neck. He got into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut, his breathing ragged as he fumbled with the keys. His heart pounded in his chest, a steady drumbeat of panic that wouldn't let up. Finally, the engine roared to life, and Michael pulled away from the carnival, gravel crunching under the tires. The feeling of relief was immediate, but as the carnival disappeared in his rearview mirror, the lingering sense of dread remained, gnawing at the edges of his mind. He drove in silence for a long while, the landscape blurring past him as he put miles between himself and the cursed place. But no matter how far he drove, the weight in his chest didn't lift. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the crumpled ticket, staring at it in the dim light of the dashboard. It felt wrong in his hand, cold and heavy, like it carried the essence of the carnival with it. He considered throwing it out the window, ridding himself of it forever, but something stopped him. A nagging voice in the back of his mind, telling him that no matter what he did, the carnival wasn't done with him. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life, static filling the car. Michael glanced at the dashboard, his brow furrowing in confusion. He hadn't turned the radio on. His fingers hovered over the dial, but before he could switch it off, a voice broke through the static. It was faint at first, barely audible, but unmistakable. It was his own voice, echoing from the past, calling out into the void. "Mom, where are you?" The words sent a cold shiver down his spine. It was the same phrase he had uttered all those years ago, when he had been lost in the carnival as a child. The voice on the radio repeated it, over and over, the static growing louder, more distorted with each repetition. Michael's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. He reached out to turn the radio off, but before he could, the voice changed. It wasn't his anymore. It was something darker, deeper, something that made his skin crawl. "You'll be back," it whispered low and guttural, barely more than a hiss. "You can't escape me." The radio went dead. Michael's heart hammered in his chest as he stared at the road ahead, his mind racing. The carnival wasn't just a place. It was something far more insidious, something that had sunk its claws into him long ago. No matter how far he ran, no matter how much he tried to forget, it would always be there waiting. It had let him go this time, but he could feel it in the pit of his stomach. This wasn't the end. The entity wasn't gone. It had retreated, biding its time, waiting for the right moment to strike again. As he drove into the rising sun, the shadows seemed to cling to the edges of his vision, growing longer, darker. He had survived the night, but the carnival had left its mark on him. He could feel it, like a splinter in his mind, a constant reminder of the darkness that still lurked beneath the surface. The carnival was patient. It would wait, and one day, it would call him back. Michael's grip tightened on the steering wheel as the road stretched out before him, endless and uncertain. He had faced his fear and won, but the victory felt hollow. The carnival was still there, lurking in the distance, its twisted rides and grotesque shadows waiting for the next soul to wander into its grasp. The mystery of the carnival remained unsolved, its darkness still alive, still hungry. And as Michael drove away, the whispered promise echoed in his mind, "You'll be back."